Hello students, today we're going to be illustrating or Bob Rossing the carbon cycle. Now chapter 3 is really about two main ideas. The first main idea in chapter 3 is this idea that energy flows one way through an ecosystem. Energy starts in the sun, captured by the photosynthesizers, the autotrophs, in that first trophic level of our energy pyramids, and then as those plants are consumed, and then those animals that ate the plants are consumed, and so on through each successive trophic level, through each chain in our food web, that energy flows through the ecosystem. And we spent a few days on that. The other major component of this chapter is that matter recycles. So that's the major difference. The energy flows one-way stream. The energy that's in an apex predator is never going to get recycled back into the producers or into a first level consumer. But the matter does. The matter, so imagine a bit of water that gets taken up by a plant, and then an animal eats that plant. So that water went from the river into the plant, literally into the animal, and then maybe that squirrel gets eaten by a fox, and that fox gets eaten by a coyote, and then the coyote pees out the water. So the water literally would cycle and move through the ecosystem. So the two major themes: energy flows one way and matter recycles. And we're going to illustrate the most important cycle in biology, and that is the cycle of carbon. So what you're going to need to do is you're just going to need a handful of colored pencils and a blank piece of paper. I know you can't see me, and that's because I'm going to be illustrating on my smartboard. What I draw, I want you to draw. So just get a handful of pencils, colored pencils, make sure they're nice and sharp. You don't have to be a great artist to do this well, but your brain loves images and your brain loves color images. So make sure you're using colored pencils. And if you need to pause from time to time to draw what I draw, you certainly may do so. Not only draw the pictures that I draw, but also draw the labels that I draw. Because really we're going to have the carbon in different forms. That might be in an animal or a plant or a tree or in the ground. And then we're going to have the transitions, how the carbon transitions from one form to the next. All right, so let's start with some atmospheric CO2. Calibrate this for a second. Bear with me, students. Just like being in class. All right, let's try again. Atmospheric carbon in the form of mostly CO2. We know that, mostly CO2. All right, so all the way over here, I'm going to draw just going to draw a crabapple tree. Throw some apples in it. All right, so I'm going to make all my transitions in red. That carbon is going to enter the plant through the process of photosynthesis. That states photosynthesis. And so now literally the carbon that was in the air is now a part of the tree. Let's see, we'll put some of those apples on the ground. They're crab apples, they fall to the ground. Alright, so this is a deer. I'm going to label this as a deer. And what's going to happen is Right, so the deer eats the apple. So the deer eats the apple. So the carbon that was in the apple is now a part of the deer. Let's add some water. Alright, so this is a river. Yeah, so the deer poops. So now we have some of the carbon in the form of cellulose is found in the deer poop. So now in the water we're going to have dissolved CO2. That states in blue, that states dissolved CO2. So some of that, we have to label that transition. We're just going to call that runoff. We're going to call that runoff. Now, doubtless, we know about photosynthesis. We also know about cell respiration. And it's entirely reasonable that some of that carbon that was consumed by that deer, some of the carbon that was in the apple that was consumed by that deer, would end up back into the atmosphere through the process of cellular respiration. So through the process of cellular respiration, that carbon could literally end up back in the atmosphere. Let's see. Over here, I'm going to draw that's a mushroom. So it's a mushroom. That's a mushroom. It's going to be tough to squeeze in this transition, but that's a decomposition. Right, so the mushroom's going to feed on that cellulose and decompose it. So we have that decomposition. We have that decomposition transition. Lots of animals actually eat mushrooms. In this case, I'm going to draw a rabbit. All right, so now the carbon that was in the atmosphere, that was captured by the apple tree in photosynthesis, was then moved into the deer because the deer ate the apple. Some of that carbon was then put back into the atmosphere through cellular respiration. Some of that carbon was trapped in the deer poop that maybe ran off in the water and became dissolved CO2 in the water. The mushroom then feeds off some of that deer poop. The mushroom then feeds off some of that deer poop, and the carbon now is literally a part of the tissues in the mushroom. And the mushroom gets eaten by the rabbit. And so now the carbon that was in the atmosphere has made its way all the way through to the rabbit, right? In the meantime, we have some other things going on here. Let's we're going to put some trees up here. Just a couple more. All right, so now we have some trees. Again, photosynthesis. Right, so through the process of photosynthesis, some of that carbon ends up inside the trees. We're also going to do this. I'm going to change to yellow. Right? So those trees are on fire. That just states that some of that carbon was released through fire. So as those trees burn, that carbon is going to make its way back into the atmosphere. We're now back to atmospheric CO2. Let's go back to our rabbit. That word states death. So the rabbit dies. There's our dead rabbit. Wrong color. I'm going to go back to red. We're going to call this decomposition again. We're going to call this decomposition. So as the dead rabbit decays, some of that CO2 would go back into the atmosphere. But let's say we have long-term death, right? So we're talking death over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Well, right, through decomposition and liquefaction, that carbon can become oil. Right, this is supposed to be the ground. Right, so now the oil, the dead animals and the dead plants over many, many hundreds of millions of years can become oil. That should be red. I just want to draw that again. I want all my transitions to be red. I'm just going to label that as, how does the oil get back into the air? Burning of fossil fuels. Burning of fossil fuels. Now, just stop and consider. I know we crammed a lot onto this piece of paper, but stop and consider what we have here. We have our atmospheric carbon captured by these plants through the process of photosynthesis. If the plants burn, that carbon gets released back up into the atmosphere, so carbon released through fire. That carbon that was in the tree gets literally physically ends up inside the deer. The deer eats the apple, the glucose that was in the apple. that carbon now literally becomes part of the deer. If you're a deer hunter and you shoot that deer and then you eat that deer, that carbon then literally becomes part of you. Some of that carbon might exit the deer through the process of cellular respiration. Some of it might end up in this deer poop. The deer poop then might run off into the water, which might be consumed by various organisms inside the water, or it may leach into the ground. Here we have a mushroom, right? That's through the decomposition, right? The mushroom can grow off of the cellulose, the carbon-based carbohydrates that's in the waste. That mushroom then is eaten by this rabbit. The rabbit dies. When millions and millions of animals die over millions and millions of years, through the process of decomposition and liquefaction, it can become oil. We then extract that oil out of the ground, and then we burn that in our factories, in our cars, and that ends up as fossil fuel. Some of this carbon here ends up through decomposition, going back into the atmosphere. The carbon molecules that make up you, the stuff that makes up you, the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, it literally cycles around. When I'm dead and gone, and I'm in the ground, and this pattern of integrity that is me ceases to exist, the stuff that is me will still exist. The carbons, the nitrogens, all the elements. It'll just end up inside the microbes and the detritivores and the things and the worms that eat and consume my body, or when my body breaks down and those nutrients end up in the soil. That's just the natural cycle of things. So the big takeaway here, all of this matter that makes up all the stuff cycles through the atmosphere, cycles through living things and through non-living things. Now just think, when we had living forms such as the apple, right, the deer, the mushroom, we also had non-living forms like the oil and the atmospheric carbon and the carbon dissolved in the water. Now there are several other cycles. Phosphorus cycles around, nitrogen cycles around. We know all about the water cycle. Carbon is the most important one in biology, with maybe the exception of water, because we know that life on this planet is based in carbon. Right. Hold on to this drawing. Don't neglect to watch at least one of the videos on matter cycles on the Matter Cycles video page, which can be found in the Chapter 3 folder of our Schoology. Excellent.